So I've just gotten back from seeing my family the last couple of days, and I got a chance to see some of the media, some of the things that my sister's reading and watching. I got exposed to some of the crap that passes for TV and literature, specifically designed for women, mostly as well. She exposed me, and obviously exposed being the correct term for toxic poison. She exposed me to Wild, which is it's a book. She was reading the book, but it was also made into a film in 2014. And the second thing that I'm going to describe to you was a program she watched called Celebs Go Dating. It's some E4, 12 to 34 kind of trailer trash TV. And I feel these two are really relevant. I mean, these are the only two things that I actually saw her watching or reading, and both of them were kind of highly filled with this crap. So, as I said, I feel that I can do a useful expose on how this crap is designed purposely for women, is meant to propagandize them to feministic ideologies by the back door. They're not to. They're there to garner sympathies, certain sympathies, that the feminists can then turn into kind of solid doctrines. Both seem rather innocuous to begin with. Wild being more feministically orientated, I guess, by its nature. And Celebrities Go Dating having a kind of potential to just be trash TV. Yet it was hijacked, so to speak. And Celebrities Go Dating, it was possible to use it as a vehicle for some positive, meaningful lessons, but the producers clearly sidestepped for the current zeitgeist, which is basically women are the victims. So, the problem then. The problem with these works is the attempt to play themselves off as culture. Wild in terms of high culture, and obviously when you're dealing with Celebrities Go Dating, you're talking kind of very low level culture. But still, people would watch this, particularly women, with their guard down. This isn't like watching BBC News, where you kind of A, expect something important, and B, thinking people expect bias, and so you can watch appropriately. I mean, I know the BBC prides itself on its impartiality, but as soon as anybody with 3 brain cells knows that the BBC has their own agenda, and when you know what it is, you can prepare yourself for it. So, these pieces are both kind of open wide and swallow. It's all that kind of stuff. It's not supposed to be deep or meaningful messages, and even though they do contain very precarious subtexts, particularly if you're primed or prone to kind of it via confirmation bias. So, by definition, these are kind of below the threshold of deep debate, hence the messages go unchecked. So I'll start chronologically for me, because I first saw my sister reading Wild and asked her to synopsize what it was about. After a couple of sentences, I could then guess what the rest of the narrative was going to be. Obviously, it's a kind of traditional, this is a woman who goes it alone narrative. She discovers how strong she is, how independent she is. She needs no man. Not that that's explicit, but obviously that's implicitly led in there. She does it on her own. And the details being that she completes what's called the Pacific Crest Trail. It's supposedly a really difficult trek to do, and it's up the left coast of America. How coincidental. And I might add how uncommon and how unique a narrative this is in the modern day. The background of this story, the pre-sequence of what happens and leads up to her taking her hard journey of self-redemption, is that she loses her mum. Her mum dies, and I don't want to detract from that. This is something that's actually traumatic. People deserve sympathy and they deserve understanding when they go through that. But it's the actions that she takes, or rather she doesn't take, that irk me. They cut down any sympathy that prior to this she deserves. So I ought to put it in some perspective here that is my opinion, but relevant still as I see it. So I think that she has an over-attachment to her mum, and that sounds like a crazy thing to say, but you know, how can you be over-attached to your primary caregiver? I mean, supposedly her father was abusive and vanished, so that might explain it. Her siblings are spread out across the state, so that might explain it. But there also seems to be an inability to rationally understand that this will happen. This must happen at some point. I mean, say we all will lose our parents, and it's traumatic. But it's the trauma that doesn't destroy the rest of our lives for most of us. So if that trauma does destroy the rest of your life, then surely that trauma is larger than what other people's trauma is, and that can only come from being over-attached to someone. You know, it's almost to me as if she could never, it would never enter her head that one day her mum wouldn't be there. You know, and if she wants to use her trauma as a justification for what she does, which she shouldn't be able to morally anyway, but if she wanted to, it would only stand if her trauma was based on that kind of irrational expectation that she would never be without her mum. But obviously she loses her mum, and even if it's, I mean, I don't know, I can't remember, I don't know exactly how she died, but even if it was unfair or a surprise, we need to grieve, but there should be kind of some even keel that we get to when we say, you know, well, she was 60, she was 70, she was 80, she wasn't going to go on forever, you know. I'm sad, but I've got to live my life. So her trauma, her over-attached trauma, leads her to commit serial infidelity to, as The Guardian puts it, a rather wonderful man. Her quote is, "I'd smashed up my marriage for sex." Now, her trauma for losing her mum has to go onto this one side, because this is detestable behaviour. Trauma or no trauma, you can't do that. I won't hear any of this that, oh, she was in a bad place. No, it's never acceptable. You cannot use your suffering as a means to cause other suffering to anyone else, and not least your spouse. I mean, you should be turning to that person for help. I mean, even if your husband is emotionally unavailable to you, then you should go to counselling. You shouldn't just start riding penises for the hell of it. Now, I'll admit to not reading the book or watching the film. As I said, I could predict the narrative without even hearing the whole synopsis. But I do know how narrative structures work, and I know that this book was a memoir, which that means that it's her writing about her experiences. And this is important in the sense that an audience must invest in the protagonist. This is how you get anti-heroes. The concept being that the protagonist takes up the role of storyteller, and that the role in real life tends to be someone we're friends with. We don't tend to spend a lot of time or invest a lot of time in people we don't like or we don't agree with, so most of the time we'll hear stories from people that we like. So this kind of translates backwards. We kind of are being told a story and we like the person, and just like our friends, we'll give protagonists a wider berth in terms of holding them to account. And it's the same. I mean, this story doesn't have an enemy, but when you read a story with your protagonist, you know, you're on your protagonist's side and you're against the enemy, and you want your protagonist to win and you want the enemy to lose, and that's kind of how it works. So even if she had set out to only tell the truth and to damn her deplorable actions, because they're deplorable, this Cheryl Strayed, her name is Cheryl Strayed, interesting, we must either in the end or from the beginning give her some sympathy, and by the end of it we always want our protagonist to succeed. You don't really ever read a book and get the end and think, I really hope the protagonist fails in what they want to do. So what does that give us then? Well, this is a story whereby a woman who is irrationally over-attached to her mum poorly deals with the pain, to put it nicely, wrongs the one person she should be using as a rock, and then we feel happy for her at the end when she overcomes her irrationality. There's no, she shouldn't have been irrational from the start. There's just a warm fuzzy feeling when she's redeemed at the end. Not the callousness that you would have if you were, say, the friend of her cheated and divorced husband. It's just the plain, it's alright in the end. And this pleasant feeling kind of must be remembered, and we'll come back to it after we get into the second piece, the Celebs Go Dating bit. You've got to remember, say, this is how it's supposed to play out with this heartwarming ending. I presume you are supposed to be left with some kind of likability for the protagonist, not specifically because she's a woman, but it's interesting that she is a woman, and that this feeling and judgment gets afforded to her. There's no femme fatale here, of course. She isn't required to make it up to her husband. She's divorced him, so there's none of that. She gets a nice, basically she gets a long vacation and forgiveness kind of unconsciously. It's not her fault that she went through trauma after all. So, part 2 is this Celebs Go Dating, right? Fortunately, I didn't watch the whole thing right from the start. I caught the ending, maybe 20 minutes or so of it. But you had this guy, his name was Stephen Bear, standing up. He basically stood up his second date, right? So, this is evidently trash TV. Anything with celebs in the title should kind of be cast aside before it starts. I mean, the only exception there probably is like celebs pay for their sins with waterboarding, but with this narrative it isn't like fundamentally biased in terms of like the Cheryl Strayed's memoirs. You know, you have to invest in her even if her actions are deplorable. With this, there's no single protagonist, so you aren't really led to be sympathetic towards any one particular character, except in the case of this Stephen Bear guy. But there was still a clear agenda inserted into the Celebs Go Dating. So, or at least this one particular episode. I mean, I'm guessing the salaciousness of it must have been a kind of standout moment for the series, because I don't know how they would top that. But anyway, this Bear guy, he dates this girl, Stacy. He calls her Blue Lips because her name isn't important enough to remember, obviously. And I say date because obviously the cliffhanger of the show is the kind of will he, won't he stand her up, and he obviously does in the end. So let's take this a little bit deeper. I mean, this guy clearly doesn't represent mankind. He plays this kind of Jack the Lad caricature, and he plays it well, brilliantly, really. He's obviously like shallower than a puddle. completely shallow over substance. He claims, I don't do second dates, as if it's kind of some moral principle or feasible excuse, to not follow through on a promise that you make. And his actions from the beginning are despicable. I mean, he begins by snogging her. Also, I'm told this is what my sisters kind of fed me. He starts by snogging her at this date night where they're all together, all of the participants in this show. And then he ditches her to ask out another girl. Now, he ends up going on a date with this other girl and leaving her after 8 minutes, apparently with the bill. So then he then sets up a date with Stacey, and they're in a pub. He's kissing her again, and he's apparently getting quite pissed, and he just ditches her. And by this point, the masochist Stacey claims that he's mysterious. She agrees to a second date. Yeah, I know. She agrees to a second date. That second date is obviously the one that he doesn't turn up for. So now it need not be said how despicable he is. By this point, he is full-on pantomime villain. The narrator is obviously putting the boot in every opportunity that he gets, and my sister was doing the proverbial "he's behind you," expressing her physical dislike for him every time. I mean, as a side note, my sister apparently met this guy in Ibiza, so she probably felt a bit more of a personal kind of hatred than most would. But the Twitter responses only differ when you kind of take into account synonyms. But this is the point that really got me. As I said, they had a vehicle here for potentially dispensing meaningful philosophical knowledge. Here was their opportunity to espouse some real world knowledge, some deep, meaningful, genuinely world affecting knowledge. But no. And as shallow and pathetic as this bear guy is, what about her? I mean, she's unwilling to listen to her head rather than her clitoris. I mean, I called her a masochist, and maybe she is, but there is also undoubtedly vanity or narcissism in her too. I mean, she's focused on having a physically good-looking man that can fuck her over time and again, and she still lets his looks guide her, not his action. I mean, he's the male equivalent of a beauty queen who can be as disgusting a person as she wants and still face no romantic consequences. And what a role model for women this Stacey woman is. I mean, you forgive and you give second and third chances to the most unworthy, but the best looking men. She wants him not because of his character, but because other women find him attractive. And then you ask yourself, why is there a MGTOW movement? And that's why. I mean, women say they want a good man, but they don't. They want a good looking man. And then he can do anything he wants. Or he can do anything that a good man would with no consequences. Or a good man wouldn't do because that good man would face consequences for them. I mean, the kicker is obviously that instead of a rational, dual-faulted analysis, we're left with the Stacey being played as the poor, humiliated victim. And once again, the tweets expose this, with the H word being a particular favourite in the condemnation of this bear guy. There's no kind of, she's a stupid, shallow woman that gets what she deserves. No, we're left with the impression that his absentia was completely unknowable. No idea at all that it was going to happen, that it could happen. You know, she snogged him and then he's gone and asked out another girl. She's gone on a date with him and he's disappeared at the end. But no, there was no possible, absolutely, he could, it was unknowable that he was going to stand her up, basically. I mean, she isn't nescient here, she's ignorant, and if you don't understand what that word means, then you need to look it up. The only bit of sorrow that I did feel for her was that the producers let her sit there for an hour. But then, I mean, it must have been clear from very early on that she wouldn't be blessed with his company. But hell, you know, you sign up for trash TV, you can't be surprised when they treat you like it. So where does all this go then? Well, it's interesting to compare the two. In the real world, well, in Wild, she acts like Cheryl Strayed acts like a scumbag to her husband, but we end up forgiving her because her mum died, and apparently that never happens to anyone. She's allowed to use her trauma as an excuse for what she did. So I'll start telling all the men that I know that being traumatized allows you to get away with cheating. And then in Celebs Go Dating, you have the man being rightfully held up as abhorrent, but the woman gets to be the victim, even though Bear's character prior actions leave absolutely no illusions as to what she's dealing with. In Wild, we get to feel uplifted by Cheryl, who overcomes her issues no matter what she did to her husband, and despite never doing anything reasonable to stop herself. With Celebs Go Dating, well, Stacey has many markers as to Bear's tendencies, but despite her colossal lack of judgment and ability to learn from the past, she gets to be innocent victim of a man we must stick the knife in at every opportunity. But it goes deeper than that even. I mean, with Celebs Go Dating, we get this kind of zeitgeist trope that men are scumbags and they can't be trusted. Obviously, as I said, this Bear guy doesn't represent the male population as a whole, but it's easy for women to watch that and then, with confirmation bias, extrapolate that to the rest of us men who have never stood a woman up. You know, we've never got with a girl and then walked straight across the bar and asked another one out. You know, maybe some of us have, but it's a very kind of immature thing to do, and most men understand that, and most men would be punished for doing something like that socially, whereas this guy, you know, because he's got fake tan and his hair's up, you know, quiffed, he can get away with it. I should put that down really, shouldn't I? And so with Wild, women, no matter what they do to others, are always victims and must be given a walking holiday, excuses, and a movie deal. So I say again then, why is there a MGTOW movement? Well, obviously men can't and don't want to try and figure out such incomprehensible double standards. Where men should know better, women don't have to. Where men must be good, they are not exciting or mysterious. And then when women clamour after good men, and then they reward arseholes with second dates. You know, where Bear gets Twitter hate, Cheryl gets a book and movie deal. And I get that the two aren't exactly equal, but still, what Cheryl does to her wonderful married husband is far worse than what Bear does to Stacey. I know she lost her mum and Bear's just a prick, but still, you can't use your trauma as a justification to wrong another. Cheryl should be confiding in her husband, not stabbing him in the back. And maybe the moral of the story ought to be that Stacey got what she deserved. How could any man respect a woman who just lets herself get pissed all over all of the time? And that's what feminists should be fighting against. Women who are unwilling to learn from the past, who make the same idiot mistakes over and over. Not conforming to this crap that women are always victims and they can't be held up for their wrongdoings and their stupidity. That they deserve compassion instead of meaningful criticism, that should they actually follow it would show these chick-designed pieces of shit for what they are. You know, excuses for idiots and not being held to the same standards as men. And isn't that what feminism wants?